London, 1665, a city of timber, shadows, and secrets. To the naked eye, the capital of England was a crowning jewel of trade, but beneath the bustling markets of Cheapside, a silent predator was sharpening its teeth. It didn't arrive with the roar of a cannon or the flash of a blade. It arrived in the damp holds of merchant ships, nestled in the fur of the lowly flea, carried by the very commerce that made London great. The first signs were subtle. A fevered brow here, a blackened swelling there, but by the time the bells of St. Paul's began to toll for the dead, the realization struck like a winter frost. The Great Plague had returned. This wasn't just a sickness, it was a judgment. Within weeks, the vibrant cacophony of the city was replaced by a chilling, hollow silence, broken only by the heavy wooden wheels of the death carts and the haunting cry that echoed through the cobblestone alleys. Bring out your dead. Doors were marked with thick red crosses, a desperate plea for a mercy that rarely came. Lord have mercy upon us became the city's anthem. As the wealthy fled to the green hills of the countryside, the poor were left to rot in the suffocating heat of a stagnant summer. The Thames, once a lifeline of gold, became a mirror reflecting a city that was slowly, agonizingly, turning into a graveyard. By July 1665, the summer heat had become a catalyst for catastrophe. The air in London turned thick and putrid, a stagnant soup of humidity and the stench of mounting decay. This was no longer a localized outbreak, it was a total siege. The social fabric of the city began to fray at the edges, then tear completely. The law was replaced by a singular, terrifying mandate: quarantine. If a single soul in a household showed the telltale swellings, the buboes, the entire family was entombed within their own home. Watchmen were stationed at the doors, lanterns in hand, ensuring that no one escaped the house of the damned. For 40 days and 40 nights, the healthy were forced to watch the sick wither away, knowing that they were breathing the same poisoned air. The scratch of a quill on parchment, the frantic prayers of a mother, and the occasional scream of madness were all that escaped these boarded-up windows. Then, emerging from the morning mist like harbingers of the apocalypse, came the figures of nightmare, the plague doctors. Draped in heavy leather cloaks coated in wax, they were walking shadows. Their most terrifying feature was the mask, a long curved bird's beak stuffed with aromatic herbs, lavender, camphor, and dried roses. This wasn't for fashion. It was a primitive filter against the miasma, the foul air they believed carried the seeds of death. To a child looking out from a window, these birdmen didn't look like healers. They looked like death itself, come to claim the city. Society's pillars crumbled. The courts of law fell silent. The markets were empty, with grass beginning to push through the cracks in the cobblestones of once busy thoroughfares. Even faith felt hollow. People searched for scapegoats, blaming the alignment of the planets, the sins of the king, or the very cats and dogs that roamed the alley. Thousands of domestic animals were slaughtered in a misguided attempt to stop the spread, unknowingly killing the very predators that could have checked the flea-ridden rat population. As the death toll climbed to 7,000 a week, the traditional dignity of a Christian burial became a forgotten luxury. There were no more individual graves, no more headstones, no more mourners. In the dead of night, the dead carts rattled through the streets. The drivers, their faces obscured by rags, would ring their bells with a rhythmic, soul-crushing persistence. They didn't stop for ceremonies. They headed for the plague pits, massive, gaping wounds in the earth where bodies were layered with quicklime to dissolve the evidence of a city's agony. London was no longer the capital of an empire. It was a vast, open-air morgue, waiting for a miracle or a catastrophe to end the suffering. While London was a stage for the macabre dance of death, a different kind of silence was falling over the rolling hills of Lincolnshire. In the summer of 1665, the Great Plague reached the ivory towers of Cambridge, forcing the university to shutter its gates. Among the fleeing students was a 22-year-old named Isaac Newton. Carrying only a few trunks of books and a mind brimming with unanswered questions, he sought sanctuary at his childhood home, Woolsthorpe Manor. To the casual observer, Newton was just another frightened refugee running from the invisible breath of the pestilence. But in the isolation of his garden, far from the stench of the pits and the rhythmic tolling of the death bells, the human intellect was about to undergo a metamorphosis. This period of forced isolation would later be enshrined in history as the annus mirabilis, the year of wonders. It is a staggering paradox. While the Great Plague was busy extinguishing life in the city's cramped alleys, Newton was busy deciphering the very laws that governed the universe. In the quietude of his orchard, time seemed to slow down. Legend famously speaks of a single apple falling from a tree, a mundane event that, in Newton's mind, sparked a revolution. He realized that the same force pulling that fruit to the grass was the invisible thread tethering the moon to the earth and the planets to the sun. He wasn't just watching fruit fall, he was seeing the invisible architecture of gravity for the first time. But his exile didn't stop at gravity. In a darkened room at Woolsthorpe, Newton bored a tiny hole in his window shutter. He placed a glass prism in the path of the narrow sunbeam, watching in awe as the white light fractured into a vibrant rainbow across the opposite wall. While London was shrouded in the darkness of despair and superstition, Newton was proving that light itself was a composite of all colors. In that same lonely year, he developed the method of fluxions, what we now call calculus, providing the mathematical language needed to describe a world in constant motion. It remains one of history's most profound ironies. In the very year that London's social and religious structures were collapsing under the weight of a medieval nightmare, the seeds of the Age of Enlightenment were being planted in a quiet country garden. One world, built on fear and miasma, was dying in the city streets, while another world, governed by reason, mathematics, and light, was being born in the mind of a lonely scholar. The plague, in its cruelty, had inadvertently provided the silence and solitude required for the greatest intellectual leap in human history. By the dawn of 1666, the Great Plague had finally begun to loosen its grip, leaving behind a city that was scarred, depleted, and mourning over 100,000 of its citizens. But London was not allowed a moment of peace. The winter had been unusually dry, followed by a spring and summer that saw no rain, only a relentless, scorching sun that baked the city's timber-framed houses until they were as dry as tinder. The wooden structures of the city, many dating back to the medieval era, were coated in thick layers of flammable pitch and tar to keep out the damp. They leaned toward each other across narrow alleys, their upper stories, known as jetties, almost touching, creating a perfect wooden tunnel for a predator far more aggressive than the plague. The date was September 2nd, 1666. The time was shortly after midnight, in a small, unassuming bakery on Pudding Lane, owned by Thomas Fariner, the baker to the king. A single spark escaped the oven. Perhaps it was a glowing ember left unextinguished, or a stray piece of firewood that rolled onto the floor. In any other season, it might have died out on the stone hearth. But in the parched, bone-dry atmosphere of that September night, it found a hungry path. First, it consumed the flour sacks. Then, it climbed the wooden rafters. Within minutes, the bakery was a roaring furnace. The heat grew so intense that it shattered the windows, allowing the dry, easterly wind to rush in. This wind, which had been blowing steadily for days, acted like a giant bellows, fanning the flames and carrying glowing embers across the narrow street to the Star Inn. The initial reaction of the city was one of dangerous indifference. When the Lord Mayor of London, Thomas Bloodworth, was woken from his sleep to witness the fire, he famously dismissed it with a wave of his hand and a coarse remark, claiming the fire was so small, a woman might pess it out. He returned to bed, unaware that he had just signed the death warrant for the city's architecture. By the time the sun rose, the fire had transformed from a local accident into an uncontrollable monster. It wasn't just burning, it was leaping. The gale-force winds carried firebrands blocks away, igniting multiple neighborhoods simultaneously. The very geography of London, its cramped, chaotic, and overcrowded streets, became its greatest enemy. People who had only just begun to breathe again after the plague now found themselves choked by a different kind of cloud, a massive, rolling wall of black and orange smoke that turned the morning sky into a premature twilight. The great death of the sickness was being replaced by the great purge of the flame. By the second night, London was no longer a city. It was a vast, open-air forge. The fire had developed its own weather system, a firestorm. The heat was so immense that it created a vacuum, sucking in cold air from the outskirts with such force that it sounded like 1,000 lions roaring in the streets. This wasn't a slow burn. It was an industrial-scale annihilation. The very stones of London began to explode under the thermal pressure, sounding like musket shots echoing through the smoke. The Thames, once the city's lifeline, became a scene from a nightmare. Thousands of desperate souls crowded onto the riverbanks, their faces glowing orange from the reflection of the inferno. Boats were overloaded with whatever possessions people could carry: clocks, fine silks, and in the famous case of Samuel Pepys, a heavy wheel of Parmesan cheese buried in the garden for safety. The water of the river itself seemed to boil, reflecting a sky that had turned a bruised, hellish purple. But the true tragedy was yet to come. At the heart of the city stood old St. Paul's Cathedral, a Gothic titan that had watched over London for centuries. Its thick stone walls and towering height made the citizens believe it was the only safe place left. People began to pile their most precious belongings, books, and massive stocks of fabric inside its vast nave, thinking the House of God was invincible. They were tragically wrong. The cathedral was surrounded by wooden scaffolding for repairs, which caught fire like dry twigs. The heat rose to a terrifying level, estimated at over 1,250 degrees Celsius. Then, the impossible happened. The massive lead roof, covering 6 acres, began to melt. Eyewitnesses described a sight that defied belief. Liquid lead, glowing white-hot, began to pour from the gutters and down the stone carvings. It flowed down the streets like a volcanic river of gold, incinerating everything it touched. The great stones of the cathedral's arches, expanded by the heat, finally gave way with a sound that shook the very foundations of the earth. The roof collapsed into the nave, creating a funeral pyre for the city's history. Millions of pages of books from the surrounding printers' shops fueled the blaze, sending glowing scraps of charred literature miles into the sky. In that moment, as the great cathedral crumbled, it felt as though the soul of London had finally been extinguished. The city was a skeleton of glowing embers, a landscape of ash where every landmark, every memory, and every street had been erased by the relentless, unyielding tongue of the flame. By the third day of the inferno, London was not just burning, it was losing its mind. The atmospheric pressure of the fire, combined with the total collapse of authority, led to a dangerous surge of anarchy. Rumors spread through the smoke like a second plague, whispers of foreign arsonists, French spies, and Catholic conspiracies. Mobs began to form in the unburnt districts, searching for scapegoats among the terrified refugees. The Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, had completely vanished, overwhelmed by the scale of a catastrophe he had initially dismissed. It was in this vacuum of power that an unexpected figure of defiance emerged: King Charles II. While many expected the merry monarch to flee to the safety of Hampton Court, as he had during the plague, Charles did the opposite. Alongside his brother, James, the Duke of York, the king rode directly into the searing heat of the furnace. This was a side of the monarchy the people had never seen. Their royal robes were discarded for sweat-stained tunics, and their faces were masked by a thick layer of soot and ash. Charles was no longer a distant figure on a velvet throne. He was a commander in the trenches. He was seen standing in the bucket lines, passing heavy pails of water alongside the lowliest laborers and mud-covered dock workers. His physical presence acted as a stabilizing anchor, calming a population that was on the verge of a bloody riot. But the king knew that water and hooks were not enough to stop a monster of this magnitude. He realized that to save the city, he had to destroy parts of it. In a move of calculated desperation, Charles ordered the military to use naval gunpowder. He commanded the demolition of entire blocks of healthy, unburnt homes to create massive fire breaks, artificial gaps in the city's timber anatomy that the flames could not leap across. The sound of these explosions competed with the roar of the firestorm, shaking the very foundations of the city. It was a brutal gamble. Fire against fire. James, the Duke of York, personally supervised the command posts at the city's gates, working until the leather of his boots nearly melted on the glowing cobblestones. This hands-on royal intervention was the turning point. The fire breaks eventually held, preventing the flames from consuming the Tower of London and the royal palaces of Westminster. In those 72 hours of hell, the bond between the crown and the common people was forged anew in the white-hot heat of the disaster. The king didn't just save the physical remains of his capital, he saved the morale of a broken nation, proving that leadership is not found in a crown, but in the willingness to stand in the ash with one's people. On the fourth day, the wind finally died down. The roar of the fire faded into a haunting, heavy silence. London was a smoldering wasteland. Where once stood 87 churches and 13,000 houses, there was now only the city of ash. The landmarks that had defined the skyline for generations were gone, replaced by jagged, blackened ruins that looked like broken teeth against a smoke-stained sky. But in this desolation, a strange miracle had occurred. The fire, in its indiscriminate fury, had accomplished what no doctor or decree could. It had scorched the plague out of existence. The rats, the fleas, and the filth of the medieval slums had been purged by the flame. From the ruins stepped a new vision. King Charles II and the architect Christopher Wren looked upon the blank canvas of the charred earth not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. They envisioned a city of stone instead of timber, of wide boulevards instead of cramped alleys. The London that rose from these embers was no longer a medieval fortress. It was the first modern metropolis. The new St. Paul's Cathedral, with its magnificent dome, became a symbol of this defiance, a monument to the spirit that refuses to stay buried. History is not just a collection of dates. It is a cycle of destruction and creation. The London of 1665 died in agony, but the London of 1666 was born in fire. We walk today on the very stones that were forged in that heat, a reminder that even when the world seems to end in shadow and flame, the dawn is never far behind. For London, the Great Death was merely the painful labor of a glorious rebirth.